Was UN Assistant General Secretary for Economic Development. He was also involved in Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. Many awards, including a 2007 Roundtrip Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought, all of which I got from Wikipedia, and I'm assuming it's correct. A Wikipedia entry also says that he advises the current government, which is interesting. It does say that. So you might want to distance yourself or go and correct the Wikipedia entry. But of course, last year when we had that extraordinary general election, Jomo was named to the Council of Eminent Persons. Now, depending on how we see it, you might want to ask Jomo this or not, and he might want to answer or not, the fate of that particular council and what it was doing, and what it imagined about the new Malaysia that became a hashtag and was touted, broadly. Now, very quickly, just to say about the reason why Jomo's here, part of the theme that we've taken up on history. Earlier in the morning, we had Rebecca E. Carl, historian of China, and many of the things you say also, I think, Jomo, you were at that lecture, we can maybe reflect on that. The other thing that really interests me is the question of intellectual histories. And as a young person, I think the first intellectual history I read was something by a man called Vincent Harding, and a book called There Is a River, and it's really about tracing an intellectual trajectory that starts with the slaving trade all into kind of antebellum, and then, into more modern African-American thinking about their own condition. It was a brilliant book. There are examples of intellectual histories that the late Benedict Anderson had, Under Three Flags, tracing anarchism in Asia. I think of the Filipino historian, Ressa Mojares, Brains of the Nation, which I thought was such a brilliant book and really got me excited about the idea of intellectual histories. Now, in some sense, I want to begin with that and ask Jomo if he can do a bit of, in a kind of self-reflective mode, think about his own location in the project of thinking about the economy and society of the country we live in, Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak. Where do you locate yourself, Jomo, in that history?
Thank you very much, Sharaad, and thank you for having me at this festival. Let me suggest that we've had a recent rediscovery of some parts of colonial history, which is extremely important. I think it's very important to recognize that most nations in the world, especially in what we call the third world, the developing world, are essentially products of imperialism, of colonialism. And if we do not recognize this, the boundaries are very difficult to understand, and the societies which compose these countries are also very difficult to understand. So I come out very self-consciously from this. In a sense, I had little choice because of my names, both African names, which are, my given names are both African names, which come out of the anti-colonial struggle. But I think what is particularly important is to recognize that, in a sense, this nation is a nation which is a product of imperialism and its discontents. And its discontents are not singular, but rather plural. And one has to recognize how difficult it is to build a nation. And especially what we have had in this country since the 1930s, a conscious development by the colonial authorities of divisions, of new categories of understanding. So you find, for example, in 1931 census, for the first time, you have categories such as Chinese, Malay, Indians, whereas previously you had things like, different Hokkiens and Cantonese and Hakka and so on and so forth.
Malabaris, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about Malabaris, but I can't remember the Indian categories, but you can find them in the book by Kernial Singh Sandhu, for example. And these categories are, so the Tamils were important, but not the only ones. And of course, the so-called Madras presidency of the of India was essentially one which embraced all of South India, pretty much all of South India. And so one begins to understand that, you know, the distinctions between Kelantanese and Boyan and Jawa and so on and so forth. You know, in Indonesia, nobody would consider a Javanese a Malay. But here we have created these new categories. When Rizal talks about being Malay, what he means by being Malay has got nothing to do with religion. Okay? And many Filipinos are proud of being Malay. And so the meanings of these words, although we use the same words in these different contexts, are actually quite different. And they are not only different spatially, but they're also different culturally, and more importantly, historically. So what it means to be Malay can actually mean something very different. What it means to be other. So I remember in 1980s interviewing somebody in Kelantan, and he was proudly telling me that his children had gone to study Seberang, okay? And I was wondering where they had gone. And then it turned out that one had gone to Dungun in Terengganu, and you know, Dungun was considered to be overseas, and I mean over the river at least, yeah. And likewise, the other one was in Shah Alam. So you begin to realize the sense of belonging and identification actually has changed over time. So now we have a state project which unevenly tries to make this sense. But I think a deep knowledge, or at least a widespread popular knowledge of our country is essential to forge because it is so complex. Many of the involvement of Sabah and Sarawak is a fairly recent creation from the 1960s. Before the 1960s, nobody talked about Malaysia. Malaysia was an invention. Of course, there was an Italian novelist who wrote in the 19th century and used the word Malaysia when he was talking about the Tigre de Malaysia, referring to a character, a mythical character called Sandokan. So we need to begin to understand not only the actual history, but also how different people use history in different ways to try to create a sense of belonging, a sense of national. And this is especially important because today we have this suddenly a sense of imperial and colonial nostalgia. You know, the Prime Minister of Britain celebrates how, you know, Mr. Churchill, who basically abandoned not only the coloured peoples of the empire, but also the Australians and New Zealanders, not once but twice. First in World War I, Gallipoli and all that, and then again. So it's very, very important and very appropriate to think about history.
Yeah. So the question of then the economy, right, and as a substratum of the foundations for a colonial society was the subject of a study. I mean, how exactly was the economy of the colony organized and what it produced in its wake? You know, a pluralistic society, or in Furnival's world, a plural society, and so on and so forth. But for you, as a young man growing up and, you know, deciding to work in the field of economics or political economy, and maybe help us understand the distinction, what was it that excited you? Was it kind of characterizing the colonial period? Was it dealing with the struggle to build a new nation and some of the really intense contestations of that, especially culminating in the '69 riots that we celebrate 50 years of it, not celebrate, we commemorate rather, and then the kind of re-engineering of society that comes after that, right? Where were you intellectually? What is it that you felt that you wanted to participate in?
Well, my motivation for studying economics was I had this illusion that economists basically create the rules for the world. And there's this wonderful new book by a woman named Katerina Pistor from Colombia, which she calls the Code of Capital. And it's basically about how law makes, you know, so you can come to understanding the institutions of modern society through different lenses. The lens of economics, the lens of law, the lens of history, etc., etc. But coming back to why I felt that the central challenge, I was what in Malaysia would be called a pre-engineering student, okay, doing double maths in sixth form and so on and so forth. And you basically were trying to figure out in the late 1960s what to do. And then you have this traumatic event called May 69. And you begin to realize how fragile this country is and how important it is to unite around a project. So in a sense, that shaped part of my choice, but it was also the post-colonial or post-neo-colonial project which was very important for me. And a third motivation, I think, was a sense of how, as the late Tun Razak put it, you know, that the whole point of the NEP and many of the other institutions which were introduced post-69 was ostensibly about nation building, except that nation building was defined principally in terms of relations between the Chinese and the Malays. Nobody really cared very much about Sabah and Sarawak because that problem had been dealt with earlier and had to be dealt with again later. The Indians really didn't figure very significantly, and the other Bumiputra didn't figure very significantly, and so on. So, but even that relationship had to be understood, and that's why, as I studied economics, I began to realize that it was important to understand history. I think my formal education in history ended in Form 3, and I never went back to actually having a formal education, but I began to realize this its importance much more, I mean, look around you, you know, less than a kilometer away you have Fort Cornwallis. Cornwallis never even set foot in this country, right? And who was he? He was the loser. He lost to Washington in the War of American Independence. But because you still rule an empire, you can give as a consolation prize. You make him the Governor General of the East India Company, you know, and then we end up with Cornwallis. And why is this the Georgetown Literary Festival? Because King George ruled. You know, at one time we were trying to get rid of the name Georgetown, and then now it's come back in with a vengeance almost, you know.
Okay, so there has been, and maybe it's a question of waves and a pendulum swing about how we feel about the past, and there are nativist responses that are also sometimes not particularly helpful in responding to the residue, as it were, of the colonial period. I do want to, because we have about 50 minutes, so I'm just, it's kind of racing through it, but I'm trying to pick up on some of the things that you have contributed to in thinking about the economy that's in the public sphere, right? And I grew up reading Aliran, and earlier this in the festival we talked about the trajectory of Aliran, but developmentalism, the critique of it. I know you were heavily involved in the discussions about industrial policy, the need for it, and more recently you put out in the public sphere the idea of premature deindustrialization, something. So you're kind of helping shape the economic discourse. What is it that underscores that? What is it that you are trying to get us to think about when you raise these issues?
When I left the country about 15 years ago, it was under circumstances where, in a sense, I was, Prime Minister Mahathir had stepped down. In a sense, the critiques had all been made about the system, and it seemed to be there was very little choice. And I was also having a difficult time in my place of employment, and so I had very little choice but to leave at that time. And now I had the opportunity, which I treasure a lot, of working for 11 years in the UN system. And basically I had to struggle with the fact that the UN was being slowly taken over by, not so much necessarily by individuals, but by new modes of thought, which had not really addressed many of the problems of the past. And I was beginning to see a number of problems. So we responded to many of these problems in many different ways, most of which, premature deindustrialization is one phenomena which we talked about, but many other things as well. And to be quite honest, I had written about premature deindustrialization well before I went to the UN. But one thing which I'm terribly proud of, if I can brag a little bit, is coining the term Global Green New Deal. And thanks to AOC, Alexandria Octavia Cortez, she has brought at least the Green New Deal part of it back with a vengeance. So it's captured the imagination of a whole lot of people all over the world. But coming specifically as far as this country is concerned, the fundamental issue, of course, is the fact that we are a country which has had, for worse, I would say, for about nine decades, our social and political discourse has been dominated by varieties of ethnopopulism, including what you refer to as nativism. And this ethnopopulism is of various types, and there's no single ethnopopulist discourse. And I would argue that the ethnopopulism, or ethno-nationalism as sometimes they refer to it in the West, is actually something which has been learned from the colonies. So if you look at the problems in Sri Lanka, if you look at the problems of many other post-colonial societies, including where tribal discourses are actively promoted for political advantage and also for divide and rule in the contemporary period. So for me, a lot of these things are very important. But one of the things which I did appreciate about the first Mahathir regime was the fact that he put industrialization and nationally led industrialization on the agenda, as it had not been before that. Because the early industrialization, the 1970s, was basically sort of, getting the foreigners to come and invest in Bayan Baru and, that kind of thing. And this, I think, was extremely important. It began with Tun Razak, okay? But people didn't begin to see the opportunities. You think, for example, Tun Razak took over the plantation companies, among other things. But what was important was the fact that these plantation companies were nationally owned, and so the priority changed. It was no longer sending back as much dividends as possible to London, but rather it was how do we make even more. So you have the beginning of refining of palm oil, for example. And within a decade, these engineers who were not taken seriously were able to create the most efficient palm oil refining capacities and capabilities in the world. Now, that was achieved more than 3 decades ago, but we have not built on that to have many other achievements. Of course, you have, the rubber gloves factory, which I think was developed in a suboptimal way, and of course you have pewter, with tin products and so on and so forth. And if you have a few other achievements, but fundamentally we have not been able to sustain industrialization, partly because we have privileged foreign investors, and rather than develop the capacity of a national industrial community, including the engineers who are so important to serious industrialization. So we privilege, for example, financial engineers much more than real engineers, and this unfortunately has created very perverse incentives in our society as a whole.
So it's very interesting because I can associate you with the generation of sort of policy ideas. And I think that what underscores that is the idea that the nation state and the governments that run it have the capacity to shape their own destinies. I mean, something that was a promise of independence, right? But to what extent are nations like Malaysia, small to middling sized nation, though we're a big trading nation, things come through us, are we constrained by our location in the global economic order? I mean, how free are we to imagine ourselves, much richer, much more affluent, with great jobs and so on and so forth, in an economy, global economy that we can't control?
Earlier you referred to Rebecca Carl, and she said, no investigation, no right to speak. Okay? You begin with facts. You don't begin with preconceived ideas. And this is a big problem which we have. We often begin with preconceived ideas. We frame the very questions which we ask in terms of preconceived ideas, usually received from abroad, usually received from the so-called fonts of knowledge, Oxbridge, Harvard, etc., etc. there is no serious effort to begin with just generally speaking, it's not a problem which is particularly Malaysian, to begin with the evidence, to begin with understanding and grappling with the evidence and moving on. So we have this problem of a lot of ideas being often derivative. We are essentially neo-colonial. We are captive minds, as Hussein Alatas said more than half a century ago. And this is a big challenge. It's a big challenge. How do we begin to struggle to overcome that? Because we are also, victims of our own lenses and the way we, when Ben Anderson talks about imagined communities, he presumes that the imagined community is the nation. But it's not necessarily the nation. It could be the ethnic. It could be, something else. And this is, I think, the big challenge that how do we forge and address the multiple problems which we face as a society going forward.
Because one of the really interesting things is that Jomo is an economist. That's his profession, right? But the other stakeholders in it are, politicians who also think themselves the font of all new ideas and seem to come up with them at a far too regular pace. The other thing is us, the public, right? And we also have fragments floating in our heads about how the world works. I mean, you told me there's a wonderful walk we had down Beach Road, and we were pointing out buildings, and you were talking about the two banks, and you said that people used to think that that bank over to our left was the more reliable bank because of the edifice, the architecture created trust and confidence, whereas this other one, which I think is still quite grand, but in a more modernist and sleeker way, was less trustworthy because of that. I mean, there are popular notions that perhaps politicians are much more keen to tap on than the advice of individuals like yourself. But how do we negotiate it? Because their legitimacy is based on popular notions, and to what extent are Malaysians, not those who kind of read stuff that's coming out of Harvard, but Malaysians who read stuff in their media or listen to their politicians describe and narrativize the economy. How do we negotiate that? I mean, I know education, we always talk about education as a way of raising the bar, but is this an intractable problem? I mean,
that's a major challenge. Okay, we talked earlier about premature deindustrialization, and we wrote about this two decades ago, right after the Asian financial crisis and its impact on this country. But what I think now, Harvard professors write about the same problem. And so there's a younger generation of people who cite the Harvard professors. And the question for us is a complex one. Do we submerge our egos, our personal egos about our ideas and so on and so forth, and then start citing these Harvard professors? Because Harvard professors, if you're thinking about salesmanship, you can sell an idea by a Harvard-endorsed idea much more. I remember years ago, when I first was studying abroad, I came back and people said, Yale, what is that? I said, the ones which make locks, And people got very upset with me because I was making a mockery of labeling. But now you have to reconcile yourself to that. So you say, oh yeah, this Harvard professor or this Oxbridge professor says this or that or the other, and then you legitimize the idea. But then you also have to say, this work has been done in Malaysia, which shows this problem. And that, often, unfortunately, the contestation of ideas often involves a lot of salesmanship.
So persuasion, right? And so you need the charismatic politician, perhaps you whisper as an economist, whisper into their ears, or you give them a blueprint, and as you have contributed to the alternative economic projects of the past, right? When there were earlier iterations of the Pakatan Harapan government or Pakatan Rakyat government and so on. So the Barisan Alternative, I think, was something that you contributed to. So for me, and I'm going to open this up to all of you soon, is we're at a point in our history where we assume that the breakthrough we had politically last year would inaugurate a whole range of possibilities, economic, social, political, cultural. We see the world in a different way. Now, a year and a half into this new world, there's an exhaustion. There's a cynicism. How do you think we can start to, I mean, and personally, where do you see this all going? I mean, are there scenarios that you're building in your own mind about the way in which we can shape this current, kind of paralysis, I think, that almost in the way that we're moving or not moving forward?
We'll run into the problem of the proverbial Indian elephant and the six blind men touching different parts of the elephant and concluding different things about the elephant. So I'm not so sure that it's the best use of our time to start speculating on possible scenarios. I do think, however, that one has to begin to recognize two things. Number one, the poverty of thought. The poverty of thought, the fact that the ethno-populist discourse has been so dominant and so insidious in our society that, in a sense, we have not been able, socially speaking, to think beyond that. And so often you can, even the certain ideas, ostensibly meritocratic ideas, are a thin veneer for an underlying ethno-populist discourse or an alternative kind of thing. So it is extremely difficult. But I think what we need to begin to recognize is that there is a tremendous need for a popular education. That as issues come up, we need to begin to pose things differently. So, for example, the question of the subsidy for petrol subsidy, who deserves to get it, and so on and so forth. And, perhaps we should be thinking about strengthening public transportation rather than thinking in terms of subsidies for individuals. Now, this, of course, flies in the face of trying to promote the car, our car purchases. And Malaysia has one of the highest levels of car ownership in the world. Okay, admittedly, Peroduas, Myvis, and, relatively small vehicles which are under 1 liter. But still, and we don't even begin to think of a post-petroleum world in a fairly serious fashion. Europe decided in 2006 to go to biodiesel. And we are still, struggling in this country about whether it's going to be more than 5% biodiesel in our diesel. We are captured. We are captured, and the ghosts of the past, of past ideas, haunt us and infiltrate our discourse in ways which we don't even begin to appreciate.
And at that point, I think, maybe we can talk a little bit more politically about the leadership of this country, because the paradox of our great breakthrough was to return a man that ran this country for 22 years back into power. So, it is deeply ironic that the change is signaled by leadership that is actually from the past. And I wonder, and I know recently Zaid Ibrahim, and it was a politician, a local politician, said, we need new leadership. And he's placing the onus of the paralysis, or the problem of paralysis, locating it in the person of Dr. Mahathir. And then, of course, with the presumption that things will change if leadership at Putrajaya federal level changes. What's your thinking about it? Are there really different ways of thinking within government? I mean, could a change in leadership mean a new economic direction, or at least a more coherent approach to economic issues that we have?
That's a tricky question to answer. The tendency among most of us is to say, oh, it is Bersatu, the party, these UMNO people who have defected from UMNO, who basically are the embodiment of the old ideas. I would suggest the problem is far more widespread than that the whole discourse in our society has been so much influenced by what has happened in the last 90 years, but especially what has happened in the period since the introduction, since May 69. So the last 50 years has been so defining that it's not just us, but also our parents and our children and our grandparents sometimes who think in those terms and cannot think outside of that. And then we have a tough time trying to understand how come Sabahans and Sarawakians see the world differently from us. Maybe they're not Malaysian enough. Maybe it's the problem of, they're not getting enough exposure to RTM or things like that. We are unable to think more broadly, more creatively, and more critically as a consequence outside of the box.
Right. In fact, if we want perhaps one formula to break the federation would be to force people to watch RTM all day long. I mean, that could be, in fact, the end of Malaysia. I say tentatively. Okay, now we have about 20 minutes, and I thought we open it up and see where your concerns are. I beg you to be very brief, ask the question, let Jomo have his time to theorize and to make comments. So if I could just take questions, if you could just, the mics on just put up your hand. We'll take 2 questions first, to just see where the room wants to go in terms of this conversation. Identify yourself, first name's fine, and then ask your question. Any questions? There's a question in the back there from the young gentleman in the t-shirt. Yeah, you can see it. Just keep putting up your hand until the mic person sees you, and then just put up your hand again. There she sees you. Okay, thanks. So, Asia Europe Institute, no?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Angin. I'm from the Asia Europe Institute. My question is basically, you were talking about ethnopolitic discourse and how the racial discourse is, over the past 90 years, is now gaining full steam in the online dimension, and you see a lot of hate speech online and a lot of this kind of racialized discourse. How would you say we can contend with this new dimension, this new warfare that's happening online?
Okay. Is there another question we could take to see? Okay, Cam?
Yes, my question is very basic, and I'm wondering, is economics a science, in your opinion? And has your views evolved as you've grown older and lived in this world of economics, whether it's a science or an art or just a mystery?
I think Rebecca threw the gauntlet down when she said the problem with the Chinese Communist Party was they were using economics that was essentially about capitalism to build socialism, and it was ever going to work, perhaps. But let's take those questions. Would you like to start either the question of hate speech or the question of your sense of the enterprise of economics?
Cam also looks older, so I didn't recognize him for a moment. But
we're all aging, because you're not aging, you're dead, I think I say.
That's true. I think, the Arab word for knowledge is ilm. Okay? So there are all kinds of knowledges. And to privilege some knowledge as science and some knowledge as non-science is something, a Popperian conceit, if you will. And I don't really, I think policy making is certainly involves a great deal of art. But to say that there's nothing to be said for rigorous analysis, it risks throwing out the scientific pretensions with the bathwater. So I think it's a very delicate thing. So I would say that different types of knowledges, where does the transition from alchemy to chemistry begin? Or what is the line, What is the line between metaphysics and physics? It's not a very easy question to answer. So likewise, I would say, what is the line between, say, physiocracy, which is school of economics, in early school of economics in the French agrarian society? When does it become science? And as Rebecca Carl reminded us earlier, is there a different economics for understanding non-capitalist societies? And if we look at what is happening in economics, there is a great deal of contestation, and a lot of the contestation is quite important. So, for example, the last set of Nobel Prizes has been awarded to 3 people for what is called experimental economics. You know, does it, you know, is that akin to scientific experimentation? So there are a lot of pretensions, the scientific pretensions about economics and by economists, which I'm very, very wary of. But at the same time, I think we can't say that there is nothing to economics except intuition, because it risks throwing out the rigor.
I do want to ask you, before you get to that question, just to follow up on Cam, which is the idea of not just economics, but also kind of policy making, right? To what extent do you think the institutions of policy making, the process of policy making in Malaysia today or in the last decades, plus just this idea of unintended consequences, that you know, often policymakers don't seem to be looking at those possibilities, the things that weren't intended, not the objectives of the policy, might actually become a thing to contend with.
Well, unintended consequences are a problem in science as well. You can have an innovation which deals with a problem, but you may not fully anticipate all its effects. I think Cam's question, I suspect, doesn't come from the Kuhnian tradition, but rather more a Popperian kind of question about what is science and what is, you know, if economics can be falsifiable, and you know, those kinds of questions.
Karl Popper,
Yeah.
Thomas Good, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
So the question behind, from the back of the room, yeah.
On hate speech, I think it's very, very difficult to deal with hate speech. I don't have any simple answers, but I think the more fundamental challenge for Malaysian society is to have a deeper and broader and more inclusive understanding of the society, and how do we promote that? How do we promote that, for example, in television programming? How do we promote that, for example, in the writing of comic books, and in history books, and so on and so forth? So you refer to a very specific problem, which is the anarchy or the libertarian claims of the internet. But I think we all know, you know, whether you believe the Democratic Party in its moment of loss to Trump, that it was all the Soviets, the Russians who did it. You know, the thing is, I think I think enough people are now skeptical about about the internet, and I think we need to promote greater skepticism, and so I'm very keen on that. For example, I was recently confronted with a piece of fake news, and I said that I'm now at a literary festival where we call this fiction, and you know, and so, you know, I do think but I think it is trying to wag the dog by focusing on the tail. If you think about it in terms of what we do about the internet, there's not going to be any serious contestation if we don't have a fulsome understanding of our society. And let's face it, that is not exactly encouraged either by the media, by schooling, by socialization more generally. So we have a huge task ahead of us, and this I think is a very important challenge for us.
Right. More difficult to weaponize a novel than it is to weaponize a posting on Facebook, right? Which is why fake news is much more of a problem than a bad novel. Okay, more questions from the floor? The questions, there's a gentleman over there and then a gentleman over there. If you could get a mic, whoever gets the mic first. No, keep your hand up so the mic person can see. Sorry, thank you.
Morning, afternoon, I'm Arash. Just a question. Do you think we should do away with our 5-year plans and move towards a system whereby we allow market forces to give the direction to the economy of the country, but change government's main role to just as a regulatory function to regulate excesses of the capitalist system.
On a similar point, I just want to ask, what do you think is the next phase of economics for this country? We saw industrialization and manufacturing, and it seems like now we don't have a growth factor. Where economically can Malaysia go to next?
Okay, very briefly, I don't think five-year planning in this country has been significant except for the midterm review of the second Malaysia plan, some of the authors of which are sitting in our presence today. So the midterm review of the second Malaysia plan basically articulated in some detail the new economic policy. And then the third Malaysia plan after that I think it was a significant plan. If you think about all the subsequent plans have not been important because what they did was basically they were undermined almost immediately. So you have in 1981, Tun Hussein announcing the fourth Malaysia plan and then handing over to Tun Mahathir, who had different priorities. So it became irrelevant. Likewise, with 1986, you have Tun Mahathir announcing the fifth Malaysia plan, and then within months, announcing programs of economic and cultural liberalization, which basically undermined the significance of the plan. So these plans are really not really very important, except as reflective of the leadership under which it was drafted. Okay, and that can be important, right? Now, recently there's talk about having a new industrial master plan, and I basically am not terribly keen on it, partly because it's going to take a lot of time, and partly because look at what happened with the first industrial master plan. Almost within a couple of years, it was abandoned. The second industrial master plan was hardly implemented, again because of the Asian financial crisis. So plans are really indications of what leaderships are thinking of at a particular moment in time. It doesn't necessarily mean they mean very much, but they are important as a reflective of a particular kind of thrust and priorities. Now, if you think about the earlier plans, the plans the British did, the original, first draft development plan for 5 years, I think in the early 1950s, it was simply a compilation of annual budgets. That's all what it basically was. Then the first Malaya plan in 1956, again, it was a little bit more than that, indicated maybe a little bit of industrialization and so on. So I think we should take these plan documents as indicative, not as if they are really meant to be implemented. We are not a country where plans really mean very much in terms of actual implementation. So we shouldn't have any illusions about that. Now,
Can we answer, because both of them have asked you a much more direct question, which is that it seems to be an exhaustion with the idea that government can lead, especially when it comes to the economy. And there's a lot of chatter about small government, right? That's one of the mantras. Small government, let the market dictate things. Business much more pragmatic, less ideological, less given to the kind of fanciful thinking that we see coming out of government. What's your position? I mean, I know there's a lot of anger that drives that discourse, but where do you stand on that?
I think we have a society where we have privileged foreign investment so much that we are basically, government policy is about how to seduce foreign investors to invest in our economy. And this is going to be exacerbated by the, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, if it ever,
CCTPP.
If we sign on to it. I basically have a very different view. If we think about the East Asian economies which have developed, leaving aside Hong Kong for a moment, they have all developed precisely because of national leadership.
And domestic investment.
And primarily, Northeast Asia particularly, Japan, Korea, even Taiwan province of China, all developed primarily with domestic investment. In the case of China, it was a bit more it's a bit more confused, but a lot of the numbers for foreign direct investment are basically what is called round-trip foreign investment. So people move their money abroad to Hong Kong, to Singapore, and elsewhere, and then come back into China as foreign investors. And we're going to run that risk because it will be advantageous for for business interests in this country to locate in Singapore because you have more privileges. You can sue the Malaysian government from Singapore, or you can sue the Malaysian government from Hong Kong. From Japan or whatever under the provisions of the what is called the ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement Scheme, arrangements. So we are running the risk, and the consequences are going to be very tremendous. Already under Najib, if I just may conclude on this point, the foreign ownership is almost half. The foreign ownership and what has happened recently with the sell-off by foreign investors, the stock market has collapsed. But what it means is that foreign ownership has gone down quite a bit, okay, but not to below 40%.
Okay, so maybe actually we need a little bit of unpacking. I know we don't have really much time, but when we talk about domestic investment, we talk about domestic capitalism. Is it then coded in racial and ethnic terms? And is that part of the problem of not, if our problem was seducing too many outsiders to invest in us, what about the seduction to get a local capitalist to kind of invest in the country?
One of the problems we have in our country, especially among the non-Malay, especially Chinese thinking, chattering classes, is to think in terms of, oh, Singapore has done better. And so we emulate Singapore. So Singapore went for foreign direct investment. And part of the reason, let's remember, after 1965, after secession from Malaysia, Singapore decided that the only way to get the West solidly behind Singapore was to have a strong foreign investments in Singapore. So it was a very active promotion of foreign investment. So the foreign investment rates, ratios in Singapore are way above everything else. But if you think about some of the dynamism, it has come about precisely because of some of the initiatives of some of the state captains of industry, if I might put it this way. Read for example, the recent memoirs of Philip Yeo, okay, who was responsible for A-Star and a whole range of other initiatives in Singapore. And you begin to understand how challenging it was. It wasn't, you had to deal, you couldn't antagonize foreign investment, but you needed to move forward very significantly. I haven't really answered our friend's question, but I think the industrialization part, I think industrialization needs to be resumed. I don't think we've gone very far with promoting services. Yes, services jobs were created. Most of them were in so-called traditional services, very little modern services. Most of it was actually in the public sector because, as you know, under Patla and Najib, the size of the civil service doubled from 850,000 to 1.7, sorry. And then you have also a whole range of other things which were happening. I think there are opportunities for investment. I think the concerns about sustainability and climate change open two huge opportunities. Photovoltaic solar panels, one, and the second one, of course, is biodiesel, which are huge. I think we also need to take advantage of our relationship with Geely to try to move very, very quickly into a particular space in the automotive industry rather than trying to have flying cars and whatnot. And so there are priorities and there are a few other things. I'm very big on pharmaceuticals, particularly for the so-called neglected tropical diseases, which would include things like malaria and so on. And we still have an opportunity to go into many of these areas and do very well in them. A country like Bangladesh is one of the leading exporters of pharmaceutical drugs in the world. India is the number one. And these are, it's not, of course we have neglected our pharmacological training and so on and so forth, but it's not something which is impossible to catch up in. There are other areas, but there's no time for that.
Okay, so in fact, we've run out of time, but one last question and a very quick answer. Is the federal government of Malaysia listening to you, Jomo, as Wikipedia suggests it does?
Wikipedia is a font of fake news. No, but seriously, I think people listen, you know, but doesn't mean they do anything about what they hear. Okay, so I think, but I do think it is, what I do appreciate is that you have a new type of discussion beginning to open up, and people should contribute to that, to open it up, because if, you know, it's not, if we just have the business as usual type of discourse of the past, we're not going to get anywhere. We need a much more vibrant discussions from civil society, and one of the good things about May 9th is the fact that that the official channels of public discourse are now much more open than they used to be.
Right, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank Jomo. Remember, we have to educate ourselves, can't just have opinions. We need to do the deep investigation before we speak. So I'd like to thank Jomo. You can obviously catch him after this. He's got so many books to his name. I don't know if they're being sold, but please continue your conversations with him after the session.